So I'm going to read a few poems and talk about them a little, but I think uh, it will not be uninteresting to you because these poems center around this place, Bangalore, and center around, something that is very much a part of Indian 20th and 21st century experience. I was born here in 1954. In 1955, my father, who had had a master's in physics and was teaching at Central College, decided that he couldn't bear the thought. And I think my birth induced this consciousness in him. He couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of his life teaching physics at a college in Karnataka and retiring at 55. The life he had lived and the life his family had lived and the life his community had lived immemorially in this place was something that was insufficient for him. So he became a part of what was then called the brain drain. And small numbers of people at that time were going to America. And he went to America and he got a PhD in physical chemistry. And then he came back in 59 and gathered my mother and myself up and took us to Canada and then to America. And that is the beginning of the story, and the end of the story is my being here. My parents died in the past few years, and I was very, very attached to them. We were attached to one another in the way that immigrant families are attached to one another, because they're strangers in a strange land. So the bond becomes very, very intense. And it was doubly and triply intense because there were no Indians living where we lived when we lived in those places. We were isolated and we were thrown upon each other. And that has sort of, it's the underlying reason that I'm here. I shouldn't really be here this week. I have a huge number of obligations waiting for me in New York City where I live. And I abandoned them all to come running at the drop of a hat to Bangalore. And I never used to come to Bangalore before. I never used to come to India. I went either to the wilderness of America or I went to Europe when I went anywhere. But since my parents have died, I've been coming here a lot, and I want to come here more and more. And somehow, I know many of you in the audience have lost people who are close to you, and I suspect a lot of you dream about those people. And I dream about my parents all the time, everywhere in the world except Bangalore. When I'm here, I don't dream about them at all. When I'm here, their spirits are no longer restless. They're quiet. And so I'm going to read a couple of elegies to them, and I'm going to describe them before I read them, and then I will open up the floor to questions, if that's okay. And I wish like that, The last session was about old Bangalore. This is sort of about old Bangalore in a way, too. And, I sort of wish I had someone asking me questions. But, actually, I'll read this poem first. I've not only lost my parents recently, and I've lost close friends. And so I've been in an elegiac mode for a long, long time. And then I was sitting there this summer getting sick of the elegies I was writing and sick of thinking about, all this stuff and wallowing around in my own melancholy. And I said, I'll write one more, and then I will never write another elegy. And this is the one that I wrote. It's called City of Grief. I should say something about this poem, actually. It's sort of... it uses as a figure, a poetic figure, the film tradition of film noir. Do all of you know what I mean when I talk about film noir? It was sort of a period in American filmmaking where hard-boiled and very dark films were made. This was in the post-war era. And they're kind of famous movies in the history of American cinema. And, where there's a sort of betrayal and a darkness to everything that happens, a kind of, that Hollywood no longer... a part of Hollywood was no longer interested in making films that had happy endings or that resolved in some way. And that tradition became very, very important, in its influence, although the direct tradition sort of died away. And, and there are famous movies like They Live by Night. I don't know if you know that movie, or, let me think of some others. The Harder They Fall. And this poem references that tradition. It's called City of Grief. No one needs an explanation here for what happened. It happened is the explanation. No one here belongs to a race, an empire, a nation. Only to this backlot, landlocked film noir city, located in infinity. They live by night here. The time is local time. The crime is local crime. The girl with the name she stole from her dead sister. The dead man in the lake know that things are forever the same. Sameness is their essence. Nothing here is sinister, because nothing is at stake. Everything is null and void of depth and resonance, not real but celluloid. Yesterday was yesterday, today is today, and no one cares why one becomes the other. No one, that is, but the gumshoe, the bird dog, the private eye, who stands in for us and is our anachronistic body double and obsolete consciousness. Always tortured by what he can't understand. He has hired himself to investigate himself, cooking his dinner for one, the red wine aerating, the pasta limp and waiting to be sauced. He tries to think it all through. There is a clue to find. There is an innocence to establish, an anguish he needs to destroy before it destroys him, an anguish he must destroy, an anguish so pure it feels almost like joy. And, thank you. You don't have to clap. The problem with clapping after a poem, not for me, but for my poems, is that one poem will get more clapping than the other, and and they'll start feeling jealous and the clapping that the other poems get, and and it's painful for some of them. So yeah. And this is a poem for my father. As I said, we are native to this area. And when I first came here, we left in '59, and in those days, it was prohibitively expensive to come back, to fly to the other side of the world. So, the few Indians who were in America did not fly back for long periods of time, unlike now where people come back every year. And then my father was establishing his career, and also he was supporting his mother and some other family people here. So there was really no disposable income. So we didn't come back until 1966, just my mother and my sister and myself. My sister had been born in America. And then in the 70s, my parents started coming back fairly regularly. But in those days, I wasn't really interested in India. I was very much interested in America. And when I graduated from college at the age of 20, I hitchhiked out to California. It was the period of the counterculture. And I lived in the Bay Area and then on the Central Oregon coast, where I worked in the fishing industry for 5 years before I came back to New York. And it was only when I was back in New York that I got interested in South Asia and interested in Southern Asian politics. And after I got my MFA at Columbia, I enrolled in their PhD program to study Persian and Urdu and the history of Islam in India, because I was very interested in partition and all of the things that had occurred. And out of that, I got a fellowship that took me to Pakistan. And then in the middle of that fellowship, I came back to Bangalore. And so I hadn't been here since 1966, and I was kind of shocked to get off the train. And when I got off the train, the first language I heard was the language I had been hearing in Lahore in Pakistan, where I'd lived, which was Punjabi. So I was kind of amazed. And Bangalore had already become a cosmopolitan city then, but my family comes from that old Bangalore that antedated the cosmopolitan Bangalore that we're all a part of now, you know. And I think it's great that all of this wonderful change has come to Bangalore. I was really, you know, it's a wonderful city. It's very alive, but my father was very much a part of that old world, and he was very much a rebel in that old world. He did not want to live in it. He was politically radical. He was much to the left of Congress at that time, and he really wanted to go to some place that was completely modern. He wasn't really interested in any of the environments that surrounded him, that grew up in him. He was a restless soul. And his restlessness was characteristic of the life he lived. And this is an analogy to him that takes place at a moment that refers to a kind of moment where he was in a period of transition in his career. And it's called Collins Ferry Road. For my father. Only a river could bottom out like this. Not a person. Definitely not. And definitely not you. You were always just a person. Not you meandering between smoking slag heaps, unmoored coal barges booming down your waters, heavier than mercury. Definitely not you. Don't even imagine it. The two-eyed fishes in the shallows are doing what? Feeding? Dreaming? No, they don't need ears to hear your ghost, who is thrashing and muttering in the brush between the river and the road. Your ghost coming back to where you bottomed out in a way inalienable to yourself, where you thought you should have died but didn't, afraid to go back to where you shouldn't have died but did. I met him up there. How did I get here, he asked me. How do I get back? Where do I go now? Don't. And then I'll read a poem for my mother. And I should has the notion of the trigger warning arrived here? Yeah, I should give you a trigger warning about this poem. It has a bad word in it. Not one of the worst words, but one that's pretty bad. And its kind of mythology, you will notice, is very Western in terms of certain elements it refers to. And I wrote it when my mother was very close to dying but hadn't died, and I was her primary caregiver. My sister lives in Spain now, so the job taking care of my parents fell upon me. And unlike my father, who went quietly and pretty peaceably, my mother struggled for years and years, and she would not go. She would not, she had a kind of toughness to her and a determination to cling to life, which was extraordinary and in some ways appalling, because it was so focused on one thing. And she and in the last months of her life, I wrote this poem. And I had people taking care of her full time, and I was managing all her care from a distance. I was still working in New York, and I kind of wrote this poem and I was driving back. They lived outside of Pittsburgh. I was driving back once a week to manage everything, and I wrote this poem mostly in my head as I was driving back to New York from one of those visits. And it's called Your Living Eyes. And it refers to an incident that had happened the week before. Your living eyes. They wheeled you, your caregivers did, to the picture window to watch the birds fretting at the feeder. Then they forgot you there and you forgot them. 1,000 years later, the angel of death sidled in, disguised as a little girl, clutching at her pinafore and chewing the ends of her pigtails. She had a look whose vacancy was over-rehearsed. But I hear your interview with her went well anyway. I hear, actually, that it went better than anybody could ever have thought it would. She said, beauty and sadness are never far apart. You said, bullshit. She said, some birds are real, some are invisible, but which are which? You said, back off, bitch. She stared out the window. Her eyes narrowed, but they didn't touch. What was she seeing? What was she saying to herself? Do I know, or do I care? Enough with these impassive forces, this one or that other one, the one who gave you life, you who gave me life. The yellow of the finches is as molten as ever, splashing on the holly bushes. The moon, pale white inside the pale blue morning, dropping its panicles of glass on the bright grass, is climbing down, but the sun is climbing up. The world your eyes see is the world as it really is, and you and I are going to live in it forever, and we will hitchhike to the painted hills together and hop a freight back home. Thank you. Okay, I guess I should open the floor to questions, although, because we only have 10 minutes. So, does anybody have questions?
Hi. Is this the only draft that you have written? What you have read? The draft of the poem, or has it undergone various drafts? Or how do you decide the final draft?
Yeah, it was, I think this sort of ending came to me of that poem, the one I just read, this idea that, well, death is such a chasm that all you can say to someone is, we're going to live forever, and because all we ever really know is inside our own subjectivity is our, the actual nature of our consciousness as it exists in this moment in time. And that was, the ending came to me, you and I are going to live forever and we will hitchhike to the painted hills together and hop a freight back home. And and then sort of images were floating into the poem as I was driving. And when I got back to New York from that long drive, it was about a 6-hour drive, I wrote down the draft, and I think this is about 5 or 6 revisions after that. You know, sometimes I'll go through 30 or 40 revisions, you know, and but this was a fast one. And other times the poem will just come tumbling out.
But how the final one is decided?
What?
The final version, how do you decide? You go through 30, 40 revision.
Right.
Who decides? You decide, or you read out to somebody, they decide?
Well, yeah, there is a decision that is made, but I don't know if I'm the decider. In that sense, you know, I don't know if I'm the one who decided. You know, something is felt that seems to be external as much as it is internal. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah. I'm a very traditional guy.
Uh-huh.
I love rhyming poetry.
Yeah.
But of late, I've been reading more modern poetry. And I want to ask where the borderline between prose and modern poetry, what is modern poetry, what is prose turns to modern poetry.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you should sort of think of it in the way that physicists think about the position of an electron. They just have a probability of an electron. Electrons exist in probability clouds, and poetry exists in its own sort of probability cloud. You can tell when a poem is not a poem when it's prose, you know. And but the traditional fixed metrical definition of a poem has been cut loose. You know, I mean, think of it as, are you an economist or do you study economics? You know? Yeah. I mean, you know, like, for example, the dollar used to be based on the gold standard, right? You know, and then they cut the value of, the rupee used to be based on a silver standard, right? You know, and I think paper money was cut loose from silver in India around the time of the First World War. And so that's exactly what's happened to poetry. It's been cut loose from a gold standard of metrical normativity, right? What you would call traditional poetry, you know, which exists, say, it exists in Sanskrit poetry, it exists in, you know, Middle Eastern poetry, and it existed in the West for a long, long time. And so, you know, what is a poem is kind of collectively decided by the culture. In the way what is the value of a dollar is sort of collectively decided by the marketplace, rather than being yoked to a standard. And we've lost something, but definitely by that. You know, there's no doubt about it. But we've gained a lot too. So I think it's kind of a pretty even balance.
Hello. Who are the poets who influenced you? Whom do you admire?
I think, you know, there are many, many poets who influenced me. There are certain poets who formed an inflection point in the development of my own writing. Elizabeth Bishop, for example, is primarily one. When I was 16, Yeats, you know. Elizabeth Bishop, I don't know if you know her, she's a mid-century American poet, very, very great poet. Never wrote very much, only published 100 poems in her lifetime, you know, but a magnificent writer. And she kind of allowed me to channel a lot of the impulses, both psychological and material and spiritual, that I had, you know, in certain ways. She taught me certain things. Whether she is a dominant influence, I don't know, you know. I mean, if I were to say who sort of dominates my mind as a poet, it would probably be Whitman. And, you know, so it's a complicated thing. Influence is so mysterious. And people ask me that question, and, you know, and I think it's a good question. but the real answer would require a dissertation on my part, you know, and it would be very boring to all of you if I gave it to you because, you know, I'd have to spend so much time. Well, you know, I like this poem a lot. And yeah. Anything else? I think we have 5 minutes.
Obviously, Tagore was a poet, but I don't think he's really heard or remembered today as a poet as much as a scholar or someone who's a writer who won.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you say is the do's or don'ts of modern, let's say, English poetry? And last, for instance, in some languages you would use all the alphabets and start a poem, and you know, is that kind of writing in English, you know, like A, B, C, D, each line would start in an orderly fashion. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
I don't really get that part of the question. The Tagore question, you didn't fill that out. That's really an interesting question.
Well, let me
to
go on that then.
Okay.
Basically, you know, Tagore was more than anything else a poet. And his poetry, the central focus was faith and in God or in an almighty or a supreme being. And that fact is lost today. No one really recognizes that. And you know, the fact that he won the Nobel Prize and all that, and for literature, is what is talked about. But does poetry today have do's or don'ts from your perspective for a person who wants to write poetry?
Yeah. Well, I'm still not going to go to the second question, but I will talk about Tagore
Please,
a little bit. You know, and you know, what's interesting about Tagore is that his reputation outside of the linguistic frame he lived in is a little like Goethe's, right? Because both of them did so many things, and they had a kind of they had a large-scale presence that was external to the poetry that they wrote, you know, even though I would consider both of them primarily poets. And Tagore has been used for nationalistic reasons. He's been used for, you know, kind of to project an idea of Indian culture in the world, and it's all sort of interesting, but I agree with you that, you know, he was primarily a poet, and it doesn't seem to be, the poetry doesn't seem to be captured in the idea, the image of Tagore that people have, you know. I mean, I remember as a kid, and this was living in Ohio, I was very proud of the fact that there was this little volume called Gitanjali. I don't know if you know, and those sort of, and that had been translated into English, and it was sort of universal in bookstores in the era of the American counterculture, you know, and that was the era when, you know, the Beatles came to India, and you know, and studied with the Maharishi and all of those things, and that book had a tremendous influence on American poetry, but then the presence of Tagore just died away. So American poets ceased to be conscious of him beyond that, like, that particular cohort in that particular time. And I don't quite know why that is. You know, I mean, it's a sort of mystifying thing about the history of Tagore. Yeah.
We are now in a global village. And also we are in the postmodern era. So in this way, you are also in the transit of modernity to postmodernity, or maybe. So in this connection, what is your impression about this transition? Especially now you are in the postmodern era. Whether you are writing your poems from the consciousness or from the reality where you are finding, and also that technological phenomena, what is the change going on? So my question is that when you are writing nowadays, what is your impression? And what about your postmodernity era?
Yeah, you know, the historical distinctions are a little different. There are sort of traveling theories, and theories of postmodernity are, from my point of view, a part of an earlier period in my life when I wrestled with those things. I no longer wrestle with them, you know, and I was asked a question by an interviewer the other day about, what I tell young people, what I would tell young people, right? Which is a version of the question you just asked, right? You know, that, and I wanted to say something sharp and curt, saying, well, it's a lot less new than it seems, Instead, I said something fairly nice. I said, well, poetry is our most ancient art, and it has always been concerned with certain fundamental things that have to do with the intersection of consciousness and the universe, and our finding ourselves here and being aware of ourselves as beings, in this incredible thing that is creation, this, awesome facticity of the world. And so that's another way of saying, the basics of poetry are always going to endure. This is like, all this stuff that people are taking, they think it's so important, it's what the ancient Hindus used to call Maya. It's an illusion. It's not real. It's like, and I don't really pay attention to I used to like thinking about those things just because apart from being a poet, I also am a literary intellectual and read a lot of criticism and stuff like that, and like to engage in those debates for their own sake. And that's probably a self-indulgence on my part, because underneath, I really don't believe any of it. As far as my poetry is concerned, I kind of feel like, well, death and love and nature, have these things gone away? And consciousness and the nature of consciousness and how consciousness sort of finds itself in the world. Those things are permanent. They're permanent conditions. And a good poem always deals with those in some way or another, in a small way or in a large way, but always it has to touch bottom in some way. And, going back to that earlier question, when do I know a poem is done? When I feel it touches that bottom, when I feel like, oh, yeah, this has gotten down to a level of reality that I can convincingly say to myself, is the substance of the world, the real substance of the world.